Good afternoon and welcome to today's Manhattan Town meeting of the LaRouche Organization. It's entitled A New Security Development Architecture, the Jubilee Year of LaRouche and Lincoln, Not Queen Liz. The present circumstance in global politics and the danger that's entailed in it remind some of us of the first lines of a refrain from an old song, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Whether you're talking about the present economics minister of Germany, Robert Habeck, or Mario Draghi, the prime minister of Italy, and is sort of a old asset of the British intelligence, Clueless Joe Biden of the United States, Boris Johnson, Otto Scholz of Germany, Macron of France, or any of the nearly interchangeable Janet Yellens, Ursula von der Leyens, Christine Lagardes of the so-called gatekeepers on finance, international finance. Pick any member that you wish of today's governing managerial class, and you find that they're either hopelessly or intentionally worsening whatever condition they claim to be improving in every field and in every way. Now, this has been something that's plagued governments in the transatlantic sector, particularly since September 11th of 2001. We've been, since that time, embarked upon a kind of a pathway for a kind of Malthusian great kill. And it goes under different names, whether that's the Great Reset or climate change or you name it. The point of the thing is that between war, famine, pestilence, and disease, besides these, we are told that the globe desires that mankind somehow disappear from the face of the earth. Now, the February 4th, 2022 agreement between China and Russia, however, was a specific expression of a declaration of independence from this planetary self-destruction trend, which is demanded basically by a hopelessly bankrupt monetary system of which those powers are not actually part or are only partially part. Lyndon LaRouche, the economist and statesman, always distinguished himself by bringing forward new ideas, and one idea in specific, which he talked about over and over, and that was what he called the science of physical economy. He asserted that the discovery and the invention of new physical principles through crucial experiments that could be successfully repeated and then deployed through technologies to positively transform mankind's productive relationship to nature changed human nature itself, and that this was the nature of human evolution. What we're going to do is play something from 2013 made by Mr. LaRouche. I think he was at that point 90 or 91 years old. Speaking at a Schiller Institute conference. And we're doing this because since this whole weekend is being given over across the pond, as they say, to celebrating a mad, old, diseased, and dying empire, which we don't want to be any part of, we choose to celebrate not that undead process, but the living ideas and centenary of the designer of the world's new security and development architecture, Lyndon LaRouche. This year, September 8th, would have been Lyndon LaRouche's 100th birthday. He passed away February 12th of 2019. And so we're going to play this excerpt to get us started today.
Evolution is the natural state of living processes. As far as we know, the general trend of all living processes is based on evolution. Evolution to higher energy flux density forms of existence. And every bit of progress in mankind's status has always been a result of the utilization of the recognition of this principle. Now, in the animal kingdom, the animals that aren't so efficient die. They go extinct. The same thing is true of nations. Nations that don't progress die. They go extinct. Europe is going extinct. The United States has also joined the self-extinction club under the past two presidents, under the banning of Glass-Steagall. And therefore, what's happening in Europe in not considering Glass-Steagall or not applying it, what's happening in the United States, even though we have a better knowledge of Glass-Steagall and we have much more support for Glass-Steagall, But even in Europe, independent Europe thinkers are thinking in terms of Glass-Steagall as an economic reform. Even many people in England, in England who are in the British system, who are bankers, were saying we must go to Glass-Steagall. They knew, in fact, that nothing else would work except Glass-Steagall. Without Glass-Steagall, right now, civilization is dead. It cannot survive. But what does all this mean? I said, first of all, I'll say two things. One, all life is based on an evolutionary process under which species go from lower qualities of development to higher. That's the animal kingdom. That's the law of evolution. Now, mankind is different than all other kinds of animals because mankind has the power to evolve voluntarily. Mankind evolves voluntarily not by changing its biology, but by changing its mind. And the utilization of the noetic powers of mind, and no animal species has really noetic powers of mind. Only human beings have noetic powers of mind. And therefore, the object is always to go to higher levels of technology, which means kill off the green policy. If you want to survive, end the green policy, because that's a death sentence. It's a suicide pact. Mankind must always progress. We must always learn from the animals and apply the principles the animals don't know how to do. Rise to a higher energy flux density. And how do you do that? You make physical discoveries. You go from lower forms of energy flux density to higher forms of energy flux density. You find new applications. Now mankind is, for the moment, helpless against the asteroids which are arrayed against us inside the solar system. We're helpless against the comets. We saw recently in Russia, you saw some quickie comets shooting through there. If they'd had a little more energy flux density in that territory, you wouldn't have had, say, a large number of people injured. You would have had mass deaths. Mankind is faced with mass death. If we fail to progress adequately and rapidly enough in order to defeat the problems. Now, in the United States and in Europe, you have a common suicide pact. It's called the Green Policy, which is a species suicide pact. It's mass death without increase of the energy flux density expressed in terms of technology and pure power as such. There's no future for mankind on this planet. Now, what's this economic problem then? Which is what all my talking about here is about. Unless we go to what the equivalent of a Glass-Steagall policy is to say our policy is to increase the energy flux density represented by application to man's benefit. At the same time, this is reflected in another way. Again, we can learn from the animal species. Progress, evolve, or die. Progress, evolve, or go extinct. That's the law. That's the law of nature. Mankind is the only creature which does it voluntarily and can do it voluntarily, and that is by making discoveries with the mind, with the powers of the mind, to discover new principles, higher principles of development. Nobody but mankind is known to be able to do that voluntarily. And people who decide to give up that voluntary right, that voluntary capability, are committing their own mass suicide.
What you just heard from Lyndon LaRouche is the actual content of a new security and development architecture at this time. That is to say, there is not going to be any way to stop the escalation of war to including up to and including thermonuclear war in the present configuration in the world without the adoption of that outlook on the actual origins of the impulse toward war. The impulse of war is actually a function of this problem of having abandoned physical economy in the transatlantic sector, whereas that has not been abandoned by China, Russia, India, and other nations. So, as it used to be said back there in the period of the Clinton era, it's the economy stupid. Well, let's amend that. It's the physical economy stupid. And you cannot change the circumstances in Europe or the Americas until you decide that there will be a return to what was actually referred to by Lyndon LaRouche as 4 laws. He referenced Glass-Steagall, the separation of speculative banking from investment in the actual needs of the population. People refer to infrastructure, but it's actually an entirely new physical platform that's required, implementing the most advanced technologies for energy production and food and agriculture as well, and industry. What we're going to do is to give you a report from Harley Schlanger. Normally he would be with us, but he was actually speaking to a group earlier today of young people, and for scheduling reasons can't appear here. But he had a presentation that he gave them, which he entitled, "Why You Need a Conjunctural Perspective to Change History." And so we're going to just play that because he explains what he means by that. And in the course of that, you'll see his view of the sort of present state of international political affairs.
Well, Daniel, thank you for the invitation. And I'm glad to see there's some people I don't know who are online, and hopefully over time I'll get to know you. I want to give you a brief overview, sort of under the heading, why you need a conjunctural perspective if you intend to change history. And this is something that was developed for me over many decades of working with Lyndon LaRouche, going back to, this is actually 50 years as of November, when I first started working with the LaRouche organization. And from the beginning, I came in as an anti-war leftist. And what LaRouche said to me when I first met him, when I asked him, I'm a history graduate student, is there something I can do? And he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to change history. And he said, well, then you have to do something. And it made sense. And the question then is, well, what do you do? How do you know what to do? And what over the years I learned from him is that you have to operate from an understanding of the interconnection of politics, of science, of culture, and economic, functioning as a dynamic that determines history. And if you start from that standpoint, then you'll be able to understand things such as what's going on right now in Ukraine. Because if you look at the media, you look at the explanations, there are all kinds of different stories. Who do you believe? How do you know what's right? Well, the first thing is it has nothing to do with something that happened on February 24th of this year, or during the period of December of last year, when the diplomatic negotiations were underway. In fact, if you want to understand what's going on in Ukraine, and I'll use this as an example for this point of conjunctural perspective, you have to look at a couple of overlapping arcs of history. And I'm not going to go back to Plato in this discussion, or to the American Revolution. I'm going to make it a little more contemporary. I'm going to go back to the 1890s to the beginning of the 20th century, which is relevant because we now have the 70th anniversary of the Queen this weekend, I guess. And it's the British Empire, in its modern incarnation today, that is the cause of the crises that we face: the food crisis, the pandemic crisis, the global economic crisis, and the ongoing war. And this goes back to events that occurred in the 1890s, when other nations were beginning to emulate the American Republic with economic development based on scientific applications of science to developing new technologies to increase the productive powers of labor. And this was essentially oriented around, at that time, corridors of development, the transcontinental rail system in the United States, introduced largely by Lincoln, But this idea caught on in Europe. You had the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, but these were connected to development policies. And what they had in common was they could bring together different cultures, different economies, different political entities on the basis of common need. Now, why was this a threat to the British Empire? The British Empire was based on the idea of upgrading the old Roman Empire's concept of divide and conquer. So geopolitics is, you divide people up into the smallest groups possible: tribal, ethnic, familial, religious, racial, national in some cases. You divide them up and pit them against each other. And this is essentially what was behind the Mackinder geopolitical doctrine, which in various mutations still exists to this day. And at its core is the idea for the British that the greatest threat would be a land-based connection between the Asia Pacific and Europe and the Atlantic. The idea of the Trans-Siberian Railroad itself was an existential threat to the British. Why? The British Empire was based on dominating terms of trade and finance, based on the deep sea capability of the British Navy, the control of ports, the control of finance. And if you actually had nations working together, not as competing empires, but for common interests, this was a fundamental threat to the continued power of the British Empire. Now that's what led to World War I. And perhaps in the Q&A, since I'm going through some of this quickly, we can develop these points more. But this is where you see the intersection of economic policy, cultural policy, the idea of the superiority of the English-speaking people, which was very much at the center of the British Empire. Science policy, which is that science should be in the hands of the powerful and the rich, not available to improve the lives of everybody. And economic policy, that what's good for the most wealthy will either trickle down or will provide enough to keep the masses satisfied. Now, this policy led to World War I, the pitting the Germans against the Russians and the Germans against the French. It continued after World War I with the Versailles Agreement. It continued with the Hitler Project, and Hitler was to a large extent run by the trusts, the transatlantic cartels of Wall Street, London, and Germany that wanted Hitler to destroy the Soviet Union and also to bring down France. And of course, at the same time, to destroy Germany, because the British were not friends of Germany. They were threatened by German economic development. Excuse me. After World War II, you had NATO set up to continue the division between East and West. And there were some challenges to this. One of the most important challenges was John Kennedy after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy trying to find, through back-channel negotiations, a way of avoiding nuclear annihilation with the Soviet Union. Kennedy also had economic policies that were modeled on those of Franklin Roosevelt, which were American system economic policies, emphasis on infrastructure development, scientific and technological advance, which increases the productivity of labor, which increases the overall value of the production processes, which improve the standards of living for a larger number of the population, which means you can have people stay in school longer. It means you can have more economic development overall. This was sabotaged by the Vietnam War, by the so-called Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. And for the last 50 years, the FDR Kennedy American system policy has been suppressed. Now, the next nodal point or arc in this begins with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was forecast by Lyndon LaRouche when the Soviets refused to accept the offer from Ronald Reagan to share Strategic Defense Initiative technology. The Russians could not keep up with the West, and as a result, eventually they collapsed. Now, from that point to the present, despite talk of wanting to help Russia, which was there with Bush Sr., which was been there with Clinton and other presidents, the actual policy was looting Russia, was to ensure that Russia's wealth, its raw material wealth, its scientific cadre, its industrial capability was taken over and controlled by Western financial interests. And these are the interests that today are behind the war and the sanctions against Russia. Because what happened is that the Russians were offered a partnership by Clinton, which never took place. This was words from Clinton, while at the same time they were sending in bankers to loot Russia. This continued under Bush Jr., it continued under Obama, it continued to some extent under Trump, although it was somewhat less, and now is on high speed with the idea of destroying Russia's ability to sustain an economy. Now, what's the other aspect of this, though? It's not just about Russia as an enemy. It's about the end of the unipolar world, the end of the period of multinational corporations and financial institutions and cartels dictating policy to the world. The so-called rules-based order we hear so much of from Anthony Blinken and the Biden team and Boris Johnson and the NATO people. The rules-based order is, how do you protect the financial interests of the broader Anglo-American empire of interrelated corporate and financial cartels? That's been threatened, and it's been threatened not by other outside forces, but by the internal rot that it's contributed with and especially the last post-2008 period, the quantitative easing policy, which has put trillions of dollars in the hands of speculators who make super profits from gambling, derivatives trading, initial public offerings and things of that sort, while lowering the standards of living for most of the world's population. And so on February 4th of this year, there was a consolidation of Russian-Chinese interests in a Putin-Xi meeting. And what they talked about is not just military policy, but economic policy, the Belt and Road Initiative. The idea that was the threat to the British Empire at the beginning of the 20th century is now a living, developing dynamic, which is incorporating many, many nations from the global South, nations that were colonial, owned by the colonial powers, nations that were not allowed to develop after the 1960s period of decolonization by the international banks. This is what, whether you call it shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, the domination by the economic hitmen, the rules-based order, it's all about keeping the flow of liquidity in the hands of speculators who can then determine the terms of trade, production, and national economic policy. And in the recent period, essentially since the 80s especially, there's been an emphasis on this idea of not allowing sovereign nation states to get in the way of the global needs of the unipolar order. And so economic sovereignty itself became a target. Well, countries like Russia and China were not going to give up their economic sovereignty. Now we find out neither will India, neither will Algeria, neither will Brazil, neither will Mexico, neither will Nigeria, neither will Indonesia. These are countries which are rejecting the sanctions policy of the United States and NATO against Russia. And so in an ironic way, the Russian special military operations in Ukraine comes out of the combination of these two effects. The strategic move to divide the world into two blocks, essentially the so-called democracies versus the autocracies, but essentially moving troops to contain Russia and now to contain China, versus the aspirations and hopes of most of the world's population for an opportunity to develop nations that will take care of the interests of the people of those nations. And so when Putin appealed for 14 years to the West, and by the way, we just have a new chronology that will be out I think early this week on the title. I have it here somewhere. It was not unprovoked Russian aggression. The chronology shows decades of NATO aggression. This will be something very useful for you to look at, but put in this context that you have an emergence of a new financial system in which sovereign nation states are allowed to act for the mutual benefit of each other as well as their own population, versus the continuation of an Anglo-American looting operation, which puts the interests of the most powerful corporate and financial cartels ahead of the development of any nation or the people of those nations. That's what this fight is about. And this is something that, as I told you, I learned from LaRouche many, many years ago in terms of having the idea of a conjunctural perspective. So I just wanted to present that as an opening, and then hopefully it'll provoke some discussion.
If you've just joined us, you've just been listening to Harley Schlanger, who was giving a presentation to a group of young people a little bit earlier. And what he spoke about is what he called why you need a conjunctural perspective to change history. In the course of that presentation, he was discussing the question of national economic sovereignty. And on that subject, let's just say to maintain national sovereignty requires a knowledge of what is called the current history. Now, we don't believe that in news reports because we don't provide news reports. The reason for that is that we don't believe that there is such a thing as current events. There is something called current history. As people, for example, right now in Great Britain celebrate Elizabeth's 70 years on the throne, British throne, do they know what they are commemorating? We are commemorating as well, remembering something that the Queen of England did 30 years ago on June 2nd, 1992. We can't let the crimes of the crown go unnoticed on an occasion like this. We want to be part of the party. But there was a crime committed on her yacht, the Britannia, which is now defunct, but then considered to be a physical part of the British Empire. And to tell you the story of that crime, we interviewed yesterday Claudio Celani of Italy, a writer and researcher for the Executive Intelligence Review and part of the team that was the first in Italy and in the world to expose that crime. And as a consequence, it became part of a national investigation back 30 years ago in 1992.
My name is Claudio Celani. I'm currently the co-editor of the Executive Intelligence Review weekly newsletter called the Strategic Alert Service. I have been a collaborator of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche for almost 50 years. And there was a time when I was Lyndon LaRouche's preferred cartoonists. And you can find some records of this in EIR. Well, yesterday, 30 years ago, on June, the 2nd of June, 1992, there was an episode which is very emblematic of a paradigm shift which took place in Italy, but which involved the entire Europe. And that was a meeting on board of Queen Elizabeth's yacht called the Britannia, which is now out of service, but at that time was fully operational. And it was hired by the so-called Invisibles. The Invisibles is the city of London. They are called like this because they generate invisible profits. A sort of cynical self-irony, I would say. So that meeting was a sort of open conspiracy in order to implement a massive wave of privatizations of national assets in Italy. And this was functional to the project called the European Single Currency. Now, the European Single Currency, or the euro, is a project that started in 1989 after the fall of the Wall of Berlin as a geopolitical scheme on one side to control Germany and to prevent that Germany projects its economic power for the development of Eastern Europe and Russia. On the other side was a geopolitical scheme to create a bloc in a system of, in a world system made out of competitive blocks. Like you have the American bloc, economic and political bloc, European bloc, which compete and conflict against each other for world power. So against Russia, against China, etc., etc. So that meeting saw the beginning of the career of a man who has become very famous today. The name of that man is Mario Draghi. He was an obscure official of the Italian Treasury Ministry. He was Director General of the Treasury Ministry. Nobody knew his name, but he went at this meeting on the Britannia off the waters, off the coast of Civitavecchia, which is the port of Rome. And he went there and explained to a selected group of bankers from the City of London and Italian managers, state and private managers, what his vision was for the privatization of the Italian national assets. Now, at that time, the state-owned economy in terms of companies which were run by the state, property of the state, they were more than 1/3 of the Italian economy. And a precondition to join the euro, so that the euro can start in time as a monetary union, was that Italy participates. If Italy did not join the euro in the first phase, the euro would never start, because Italy is a founding member of the European Economic Community, and was unthinkable that you start the euro without Italy. I mean, you have France and Germany, but you needed Italy at that time, also because a scheme that Italy should help controlling Germany. So a precondition for that was that Italy privatizes all of its national assets and uses the income to pay or to reduce the national debt. This was the second obstacle to join the euro. So Draghi went there, explained what his vision was, and a key point in his speech in front of these bankers was that the Italian political system had to be changed in order to implement this privatization, this wide-ranging privatization scheme. In other words, the system was an obstacle. And after that meeting, several things happened. Very important members of the judiciary were assassinated. There was a speculative attack against the lira in September led by George Soros. And people remember this because this destroyed what at that point was a European monetary system. So we didn't have the euro, we had national currencies, but these currencies were regulated by a treaty agreement and flexible, semi-fixed parities. So George Soros led a speculative attack in September that year, which destroyed the system and forced Italy and Britain to get out of the system. So, and then a big so-called anti-corruption operation investigation based in Milan, based in the Milan prosecution office, started to put under investigation the leadership of all political parties except one, and they destroyed the political system. And so the way was free to implement Draghi's plan. Draghi then became the head of the privatization committee. For 10 years, he managed privatizing everything which was to be privatized: banks, steel, infrastructures like highways, energy, electricity, shipyards, you name them. And then he was rewarded by being appointed European director of Goldman Sachs. This lasted a few months. Then he was sent to become the central banker of Italy. And from that place, then he became, in the 2005, he became the no, sorry, I'm mixing the dates. In 2011, he became the European Central Banker. And then at that point, he worked as the guy who started the largest monetary expansion in history, at least for Europe. So he's famous because as the chairman of the European Central Bank, he launched for his famous statement that he would save the euro whatever it takes. So this whatever it takes has become a symbol to indicate that he would do everything to save the euro. And he has become famous for this. I mean, his fame of economist as an economist is totally undeserved. But let me add one thing before doing this. After the breakout of the global financial crisis in 2008, there was a big campaign to introduce a reform of the monetary and financial systems, and we led this campaign. Lyndon LaRouche pushed for the reintroduction of Glass-Steagall, bank separation. In this way, he said, we would, on one side, protect families and savers and companies who have personal and commercial accounts, and we protect those banks by separating them from the investment banks. And these investment banks, they lose all kind of protection. They will have no access to central bank money, to deposit money, and in this way, if they go bankrupt, this has no effect on the national economy, on the physical economy, on the families. So this was a big campaign, and actually in the United States, even political parties adopted this, and in Europe as well. And we introduced several legislation proposals on this. So this became a great moment of peril for the oligarchy, because if this is pushed through, and it's valid today. I mean, today this is step number one, which we should take to prevent war. And the oligarchy then scrambles to try to avoid this. And what they did, they created an organism, a body, which should oversee changes and reforms in the financial system. They called it the Global Stability Board. And guess whom they appointed to control this? Mario Draghi. So Mario Draghi was there for a couple of years, and then he was replaced by, guess who? Mark Carney. Now, readers of EIR and followers of the LaRouche movement know who this guy is, because this is now maybe the number one agent for implementing the so-called Great Reset, the green economy, shifting the trillions, shifting the economy from a fossil-based economy into a climate-based economy, and thus creating a big financial bubble, which is nothing else than a bailout of the current bankrupt system. So this is, who Mario Draghi is, and now he has been sent to Italy last year to become prime minister in order again to save the euro, because we have a tremendous crisis. We had COVID, and we had a total increase of debt on all sides of the economy. The banking system is again bankrupt because they rolled over the debt, but they didn't produce anything. So now the system is more bankrupt than before.
So the government of Italy and the governments of Europe were disappeared during the 1990s, and that was done to loot the economy of Europe. Here's a question. Is a new, perhaps final phase of the same process underway right now under the pretext of trashing the entire transatlantic economic system to support the noble struggle of the Azov battalion in Ukraine? The same process of disintegration that was just described by Claudio in Europe came to the United States in the form of September 11th, 2001. And the fact that 9/11 also happened to be election day in New York back in 2001 can be seen as a kind of metaphor for what was actually happening right then at that time to the American electoral process itself, which happened in 2000, that election, the presidential election, in 2004 and later. And the same process that was happening to the United States economy, particularly between 2007 and 2008, of course, the world economy, the so-called Great Recession, as it's sometimes euphemistically called, and ultimately January 6, 2021. Now, to discuss what actually has been happening, it has to be viewed from what is called by Lyndon LaRouche, the complex domain. And to do that, what I wanted to do is to pull together a panel of people that could give a perspective on this. And we have three guests with us. We have Anastasia Battle, who is with us, and we have Suzanne Klebe, and we have Gerald Rose. All the three have been organizers with Lyndon LaRouche, with the LaRouche organization, and also with co-organizations of LaRouche, inclusive of the Schiller Institute and so on. Now, what's been involved and has been happening is a certain kind of process involving the American elections. We're going to start out with Suzanne first, and we're going to follow her by Jerry Rose, and then Anastasia will be bringing in something which I'd like to say from the beginning is our actual shift in approach. The shift is that the American elections have to be viewed from an international perspective, not merely the political process of electing a president. No, the actual process of the American electoral system, which is very, very different than the participation that is requested by citizens. And we'll be discussing the character of the difference in the reports, and therefore we don't want to, we just get right to the reports, and in the course of the discussion, make this general point. So Suzanne, we're going to start with you. Go right ahead.
Okay. I also have some slides, which maybe Dave can put up. This is the first one. On May 31st, a few days ago, I guess it was now, in New York, we pulled off a real major project. We filed signatures to get Diane Sare on the ballot as a LaRouche independent candidate for the U.S. Senate. She would be opposing Senator Chuck Schumer, who has been one of the major forces for over 40 years in the Senate and has played a critical role in every war the U.S. has been involved in and is known as the senator from Wall Street. What you see here is a crowd of people, citizens, Americans who petitioned to get Diane on the ballot. They moved into the Board of Elections. There was cheering, there was photos taken and so forth, because what they had accomplished was thought to be impossible by people who were restructuring elections in the United States in maybe a similar way to what Claudia was talking about restructuring government to allow certain kinds of financial controls. This is definitely the case, and that's what I want to show you, some of these slides to give you a picture of that. So the next one, these are the 29 volumes of petitions that we turned in over 6 weeks of collecting 45,000 plus signatures. We went considerably over. Next. And here they are processing these in the Board of Elections. Next. And here's Diane, who is our candidate, who obviously shows the mood having accomplished this event. So the next one. Now, why was this such a big deal? I mean, on the one hand, it's very important to have Diane on the ballot, but also this was done in the context of a major move in the state to deny access for candidates to be able to run. It is explicitly stated that changes in the election law, which were put into the budget, never actually debated in legislation, put in 2019, 2020, and again in 2020, 2021, were done in order to remove parties, independent parties, from the ballot by making conditions so difficult it was seen that people couldn't meet them, and similarly to keep independents off the ballot. So I'll just go through a few things to give you a picture of this fairly quickly. Next. This is the petition to run for office. You have to get these signatures. Next. The requirement used to be 15,000, and this is where the changes came in. How did it go from what was 15,000 signatures for an independent to get on the ballot. How did it triple? What happened? Go ahead. And here's the legislation where they took a red pen and wrote out 15,000 and they put in 45,000. One way it was done was simply by changing the rules. And this is a major move of oligarchical control. Whoever controls the rules controls the process. The explicit statement was that by changing the election rules, they could change the outcome. Next. And they set up a commission to do this, which they said had the power of law. Next. And they said, ironically, they were doing this because there was a perception of corruption of elections in New York State, which of course is absolutely true. And in order to end the corruption, they were going to set up a commission to allow electoral finance reform. And in the context of that, they said they had to throw people off the ballot. Next. Their contention that if they allowed what they called frivolous candidates, or candidates who did not have the support, did not have the ideological position of the majority of voters of the state of New York, that somehow they would drain a fund they were setting up to give matching funds to candidates. This was clearly debunked. It was simply not true. Next. But this is the statements that they were making, that they had a $100 million fund they were going to give to match contributions that would get the corruption out. But again, that this could not go to people they called frivolous or to candidates who did not reflect the novel and distinct ideological identities of the electorate of New Yorkers who ultimately fund this public campaign. Now, imagine a statement like that they could reject people based on that they said they didn't reflect the novel and distinct ideological identity of the electorate. Well, wait a second, isn't that what elections are supposed to determine? What's happening here? Go ahead. And so we launched a huge fight on this, not just saying we could accomplish this, we could get these signatures, which was an enormous challenge. It represented time, being in the snow, being in the rain. This was done all by volunteers throughout the state of New York. The people you saw who entered the Board of Elections there, they came from Buffalo, from Rochester, from the Bronx. They came from every place. They were citizens who were determined to say, we can nominate the candidates that we choose to vote for. And we asked the question, how can you talk about the right to vote if you deny candidates the right to be on the ballot by manipulating the rules? Go ahead. And this is a very critical question around elections in the US, because during the voting rights fight in 1965, this exactly was the situation where as part of the Voting Rights Bill passed in 1965, there was a section called Section 5, and they said, we know the way the system is rigged. You say in the amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment of the US Constitution after the Civil War, that African-American men had the right to vote. But what was then done was to say, yes, but we set the rules. And the white primaries, as they called them in Mississippi and in the South, said, sure, you have the right to vote, but we can change the rules. We can say you have to jump over the moon. You have the right, but you have to jump over the moon. You have to recite the Constitution backwards. Next slide. This was taken up in the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and it was set up explicitly that you couldn't change the rules without having an oversight of the Justice Department at that point. But this idea that that whoever makes the rules can create the results, this is exactly what was attacked by the Voting Rights Act, but this is an idea that they were reasserting, not just in changing the laws in New York State, but also in what's happening around the country around gerrymandering districts, which people have seen, these wild district maps where they say, well, we can determine which candidate will win based on how we draw these district lines. In New York State, this was so corrupt that it's gone through 3 sets of appeals. These district lines they drew, it still just recently was determined what the congressional districts are. You have people running for Congress and they don't even know what their district is. So this is part of, on the one hand, the attempt to say, We can control who gets elected by changing the rules. And on the other hand, the fact that you really do have a question of whether the citizens have anything to say about this at all. Next. And this is really the question of the American system, and whether or not you have an ability to have the citizens have any control whatsoever. Whether you have an oligarchy in which whoever sets the rules is in control, or whether you have the citizens themselves play a role. Now, one of the things that we kept have happening to us, our petitioners around the state, which was quite amazing, is we had people thanking us for petitioning, which seemed unusual, really. You don't normally think you're going to thank somebody who asks you to sign a petition. But the thing is, there's an incredible sense of frustration in the United States that people have lost control of the government, that it really has nothing to do with them anymore. And of course, there's good reason to think that. On the one hand, you have the government, the Biden administration, pouring out billions of dollars, 40 billion here, 30 billion there, sending advanced weapon systems to Ukraine. Nobody's asked the American public about that. And constitutionally, it's Congress's responsibility to declare war. During the escalation in Iraq, in Syria, Congress debated it. Should they go to war? It's their responsibility. Now they say nothing. Similarly, on the economic situation, we have a move around inflation. We met this where people were signing our petitions, people leaving grocery stores who had to leave food behind because they couldn't afford it. We had people reporting from certain areas in New York where they had grown up that the level of desperation, of homelessness, of drugs, even shocked people who had lived there for many years. The inflation is simply a form of taxation turned inward. People's life savings are being taken away from them. You might remember the term bail-in, which LaRouche talks about quite a bit, around a process where you're not bailing out the financial system, they're simply bailing in and taking people's life savings. Who has asked the American public anything about this? Nobody. And that's the reaction we were getting as we were gathering these petitions, both support for the idea that Diane was saying she had the right to be on the ballot, but also, are you going to reconnect the role of the citizen back to the control of the government or not? Next slide. Now, this is directly connected to a much larger shift that occurred with 9/11. And since then, with a series of moves, including the wars that the US has been involved in since the end of the Cold War, all based on an intelligence apparatus that simply lied and never had any repercussions of that. We saw it with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It goes on over and over, but how does it relate to the elections? Well, you might remember 2016, even before the election, the intelligence agencies were saying Russia was interfering in the US elections. This was never demonstrated. Over the next years, from 2016, 2017, Robert Mueller set up an investigation. There were investigations after investigations, all of which came to the conclusion that there was no proof that such a thing had occurred. But by accusing the Trump, at that point, just his candidacy, of dealing with foreign powers, with, that there's certain kinds of intelligence rules that went into effect. One is something called Executive Memorandum 12333. There's certain things that they used for a lot of the operations that were run against the Trump candidacy. And this is a big part of it. Now, this slide in particular is an example of this. You might remember, if you think of the chronology, in January of 2016, Hillary Clinton was under big attack for her private server around the emails. Also, there was the later results where her emails were showing an attack on Bernie Sanders and an attempt to disrupt his campaign. By May, there were charges that those emails were released because of a Russian hack. And holy hell began to break loose about this question of the Russian role. The intelligence community, the same people that created Iraq and everything else, immediately clicked in by August, or maybe it was October, saying that there was absolute proof of Russian collusion. And this continued. This is a thing from Twitter, from Hillary Clinton, where she pushes this idea of Russian collusion. She says 4 things you need to know about the Trump organization's secret server to communicate with the Russian Alpha Bank. And then it goes through charges of the Russian connection to Trump around this Alpha Bank. This was before the election. These kinds of things escalated in the following way. On the electoral side, what began to happen was a move to say the elections themselves were national security issues. That the FBI, the Homeland Security, all the 16 intelligence agencies were brought in to begin to control at a much higher level the US electoral process altogether. And this particular Twitter is significant because this had to do with the escalating cases, which were just taken on by John Durham in a court case against a leading figure in the law firm Perkins Coie, which represented Clinton and the Democratic Party operation. This case just took place, and there was a decision May 31st, the same day we were filing our petitions. The decision incredibly backed, the sussman in this, which I can go through in a little bit. But the point is that what is occurring here is a move to integrate in an actual perspective being run by the intelligence agencies and directly into London, now into the electoral process itself and the control of US elections. Go ahead. In fact, you can see here, it's not really in focus, but in 2019, the Worldwide Threat Assessment Report came in, and the number 2 thing it lists here is the question of elections themselves as national security issues. Go ahead, the next one. Now, just to give you a sense of this, what happened with it is the intelligence agencies insisted that this collusion occurred. The Trump administration came in and began to hack away at the critical issues that the Anglo-American networks were pushing. They pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership almost immediately when Trump got in. In April, he pulled out of the Paris Accords and began to debunk the idea of global warming, which in the earlier national worldwide assessment reports was also said to be a national security issue, with the full support of the military apparatus pushing the climate change agenda. Trump was meeting with Xi Jinping. He was saying it was good to have peace with Russia. By September of that year, there were already calls for his removal, essays talking about a potential coup. And in 2018, the British House of Lords report came out and again put together this question of elections with their idea of control of the process in the US, where they actually issued a report saying that Trump himself had opposed the Anglo-American positions to such an extent that there had to be an assurance that he would not be reelected, nor anyone like him. This was 2018. Just to give you a sense of this, this is one of the players in this thing. His name is William Evanina, and he is Homeland Security. Homeland Security was intimately involved in this whole restructuring of elections. Because of the charge of collusion, they began to move into the state election boards and to insist that they had to be reorganized because of the threat of a Russian interference. This became so extreme that Charles Krebs, who was part of this counterintelligence operation in elections, was ultimately removed by Trump. But as he was going out, there were all these discussions about their intense meetings with the states, how this was unprecedented. Normally, the states did not work with the federal government around elections. Krebs actually talks about an hour-to-hour reporting system in the election in 2020, going directly into the intelligence agencies about what was happening on the ground. William Evanina was one of the key people on this. He's the head of counterintelligence and security. This picture is taken from a roundtable event, next slide, in which he said the following. He said, social media and the ability to promulgate information expediently on the web is going to be a big vulnerability for democracies going forward. He said during a conference hosted by none other than the cybersecurity company CrowdStrike, who you might remember was the company that was dealing with Hillary Clinton's servers when the question of the hacking occurred. He said, we have not succeeded across our democratic countries in explaining to our populace how important and how fragile our democracy is. The core fundamental basis of that fragility is free and open elections. Very interesting. The statement that the electoral process itself, were it to elect the wrong people, that this is a question of national security. He argued that the threats to democracy are more enduring than the impact of terrorism. And actually, in that worldwide threat report I showed you, there's a list of threats, including terrorism, and the question of elections and the need to control information is high up on that list. He said we have to do a better job of educating our voters and our populaces in our democratic countries why the threat to democracies through elections is an existential threat. Next slide. This event with CrowdStrike, which they held, as you can see here in October 2020, here you have Evanina here representing the U.S. Homeland Security. Above him is the president of CrowdStrike in the U.S., who also is ex-FBI and so forth. He had actually testified in one of the congressional hearings that there was no evidence of a Russian hack of those servers that CrowdStrike was involved in, but still they pushed this idea of Russian collusion. So that's who he is. And the guy on the left, bottom left, is a top defense security guy from London. And what they talked about in this discussion is the need to have tight control of both information by which the population might make a decision in an election, and then the electoral process itself, and that this is an international issue and also includes privatization of the election process itself. Next. So this all ties into what we're talking about, where on the one hand, you have something fairly simple, which is I want to run for office. I want to be a candidate. You run into a buzzsaw of laws, rules, changes, the idea of which is to pre-select before you even get into the elections who is and who is not allowed to be a candidate. And that's fairly straightforward. So we did the impossible. We had citizens who insisted they had the right to have some control over the government process. That is, after all, the American system. And at the same time that occurred, you have this May 31st trial. On the left is John Durham, who you might remember was appointed special counsel as the Trump administration was going out of business, more or less. That has continued because he was special counsel, so that position did not dissolve. The guy on the right is Sussman, who was just prosecuted for lying to the FBI. He worked for Perkins Coie. He was having extensive meetings, bringing in all sorts of slanders. This included, in particular, the Alpha Bank report that Trump was working with them, which was later debunked. He got this stuff. He pushed it through the Clinton, he brought it in as part of the Clinton campaign, pushed it to the press, and then he held meetings with the FBI in which he pushed this so they would begin a bigger investigation of Trump with these charges of foreign collusion. There are check stubs. They actually billed, these people for their time in doing this. He was charged with lying to the FBI, saying he was not representing a political campaign or Clinton's campaign, that he was doing it just as a friendly gesture of interest. It was clearly the case that was a lie. However, on May 31st, he was found innocent. But the investigation continues. The media is saying it's over. Durham failed. Durham is now moving into the next step. But the question is, will he actually go after what we would go after, which is the involvement of British intelligence agencies in destroying the U.S. pulling the US into wars we shouldn't be in, the ongoing destruction of the US economy. And part of that is the fact that this law firm, Perkins Coie, involved in this, has been one of the most critical law firms in the reorganization of US election law altogether. Next slide. This is the charge. Go on to the next one. And this is one of the key people in this. This is Mark Elias. He was the chief lawyer for Clinton. He was the one that hired Fusion, the firm that did all the investigations coming up with this scandalous stuff, which wasn't true, which they then pushed to the press and to the intelligence agencies to disrupt the ability of the Trump administration to function. He also was the one who hired Christopher Steele, who was British intelligence, who wrote this report that they used against Trump. And you see here this headline, Perkins Coie Mark Elias became every Democrat's favorite lawyer. Now he wants to reform democracy itself, which is true. I mean, he is involved in every critical law case in reorganizing election law all over the country, and they are in the process of doing this. There's a fight about it in many states, but the idea that if you can change the election law itself to determine who's a candidate, who isn't, what the outcome could be, this is really critical for people to be on top of. We ran into it when Dianne decided to run, but it's going on all over the country because, in fact, this is one of their critical forms of control. Next slide. And these are just some of the quotes from the trial, but they're interesting, but go ahead. This is what Elias says he's pushing. This is the guy talking about no excuse absentee voting, whether or not you need an ID, all these things which have their own relevance, but have nothing to do with what they're actually doing to manipulate elections and manipulate who is actually in control of policy in the country. Next. And, they modeled this on the old oligarchical principle, which Plato attacked in his Republic, which says justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. This is the position of Thrasymachus, which the American Revolution attacked. Next. And since it is the question of the Queen's Jubilee, and we are asserting in this that there is a critical difference between the American system and the British system. And if we don't actually go into that, you really lose perspective about how we're going to get out of this crisis. This all appeals directly to the question of the role of citizens in elections. The preamble says that we, the people of the United States, to have a responsibility to promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And in that context, we created this government. The idea was, how do you promote the general welfare of not only yourself, but of posterity, of future generations? That's the responsibility of citizenship, to figure out how to do that, and the role of government. It's not always obvious. It's something that LaRouche has written extensively on in this question of relative potential population density. How can you actually judge whether the policies you implement are in the general welfare interest, not only now, but into the future? Next slide. And that responsibility of government, as the American Revolution adopted it, and the role of elections and the involvement of citizens in that process, is directly contrary to the British system, which is really the kind of thing Claudio was talking about Britannia and that concept of economics. Because here you have Adam Smith saying explicitly, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue as great as he can. He generally indeed neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. I mean, if you consider the difference between saying the general welfare is unknowable, it's better off if you don't think about it, just pursue your own gain, That's what they define as an economic policy, in contrast to the idea of the American Revolution idea of the general welfare, the question of government, and therefore the question of the citizens' role in that government. And then the last slide, I think, is Adam Smith wrote that in The Wealth of Nations. And in 1776, by the way, Alexander Hamilton responded, or said in his own right differently. He wrote about the creation of the wealth of a nation. And here he says, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. So that's the American system. The development and of the minds of the population and the ability of people to be productive. And the question of elections, how do you create the conditions in which those policies are debated and determined, is a critical one. And the attack on the electoral process, either by manipulating rules that you make up and then pushing this off into intelligence agencies, which think they can control it for their conception of the general welfare, or for the they call it national security. The British, again, it's, if you read the quote from the British House of Lords report in 2018, where they simply say, as the Queen might say, this administration, we simply can't have it. This is against the Anglo-American policy. We have to make sure such people are not elected. And, you know, there's different ways that they have to do that.
Thank you, Suzanne. What we're going to do is to go to Jerry, and the reason we're going to do this is, Lyndon LaRouche ran for president 8 times in the United States. What happened in his presidential campaigns are very important in terms of the injustices against Lyndon LaRouche, but the most important thing is the way in which he chose to run it. And every time that Lynn would get professional advice about how to run his campaigns, he summarily rejected it. Now, many times, other people who prefer to disparage Lyndon LaRouche and his group talk about the fact that nobody can understand what Lyndon LaRouche is doing. The reason for that is that people don't understand the American electoral process actually. They understand what they have placed in office. Ask yourself the question, look at the last 50 years. Is what you placed in office what the country required? Now, either there's something wrong with the electoral process or there's something wrong with the electorate. Maybe what the problem is that people don't understand that elections are not necessarily about voting. They're about electing. And electing and voting don't necessarily mean the same thing. Now, there's a reason to say this because there's a process that we introduced, which Jerry was central to in the actions that were taken in the day-to-day work, which qualified Diane Sayre to run for the ballot. And I'd like Jerry just to take this and to discuss it, because what I think he's going to tell you may shock you, but I guarantee you insist that the only way you can get back this country's government is to do it the way that we approached, that it was approached, that the election of the process of qualifying Diane Sayre for the ballot was approached. So, Jerry?
Yeah. The one, I would say that the most central theme of the campaign to put Diane on the ballot was discovered in the course of discussing or presenting Percy Bysshe Shelley's Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. This was central. I think everybody who participated in this process understood it. The theme, the first line of the Hymn to Intellectual Beauty is the awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen, among us. The awful shadow of an unseen power. That was the nature of this campaign, because the issue was doing something that when we started was impossible. Quite literally, it was a question of a discovery, a constant discovery, a constant process of discovery on how to accomplish it. If we had tried any other approach, it could not have been done, ever. Now, the impossibility of getting triple the amount of signatures itself, under Diane's absolute rigorous insistence, this can be done. If we had blanched, if we had said, we're going to do anything less, we would have, I assure you, given what Suzanne Klebe had just gone through, there's no way that this oligarchy, that this collapsed ancient regime, Shelley had a lot to say about that too, this collapsed ancient regime or ancien regime would have anyway let us get on the ballot. That was the whole purpose of it. So the actual meetings every night were a deliberation upon accomplishing what would have seemed to be something impossible. And part of the discussion process was this question of poetry. From the very first night, we presented in different forms a classic poem. In one case, we actually sang, or we had a member sing a beautiful song. But nobody thought that was entertainment. Because from the very beginning, this was a spiritual exercise and understood to be a spiritual exercise. The first discussions were, how do we not get drawn into and get upset by the fact that the population has been undermined for, I don't know, you could say since Franklin Roosevelt, but increasingly in the 70s, 80s, the rational process of discussion had been constantly attacked and undermined. And those who were great, like Kennedy, like King, like others, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, you could name them, were murdered on the streets by the intelligence community, as Suzanne Klebe has just pointed out, what they were up to. So there was first this question of what is the level at which you must approach the population? And this was an open, constant discussion. And it really revolved around this question of seeing into the individual that they wanted to do good and bringing that out of them in the simplest, most succinct way you could, because you had to get significantly over 45,000 signatures. So therefore, the question of poetry and discovery was central to the discussion every night. There was no other way you could do it. And we discussed, what many said to me was very provocative. The poetry presented was very provocative. but it was about discovery. It was about the nature of discovery. It was about the nature of the human soul in discovering. It was about the blocks that come up. One was Ode to Indolence, which is an extremely ironic poem by Keats. Another was the Ode to Psyche and the dialogue you have with yourself and the nature of that dialogue. Another, which I personally enjoyed, is this wonderful poem on Chapman's Homer, in which the issue was just literally Keats had read Chapman's Homer many times, but it was the first time he read it, and it was like a new planet coming into view. And then the last stanza of the poem was about Cortez discovering the Pacific Ocean for the first time. And the stunning poem, or the stunning idea in that poem, is stout Cortez looking at the Pacific, and his men with wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. With wild surmise, silent, because they were awestruck by what they had seen. They didn't know the full implications of it, but they understood. They had seen and experienced something of such a magnitude that the discovery of which will change the course of human history. I could go through it. I'm just giving you a taste of it in terms of the poetic principle, classic poetic principle. And it wasn't the poems per se. It wasn't, as I said, they weren't entertainment. It was a question, and all of us participated in a process of discovery of something that, as Dennis Speed has often brought up on this discussion, before the dome in Florence was conceived of, no one could do it. And as it was conceived of as a problem, at the time, there was not the technology to do it. And the combination of determination, a deliberation of a spiritual nature to reach deep into people succinctly, playfully, succinctly, that the whole process was defined by a poetic principle. But that poetic principle came to be because there was a life and death fight, because the leadership of the United States, the leadership of Western Europe is gone. And there was a life and death fight to present a new leadership shaped by Lyndon LaRouche's total commitment to what was called the Manhattan Project, in which he put the combination of leadership together for this kind of discovery. And we did it. And we're going to do more of it, because that is the actual nature of a real campaign, to discover the to apply principles, but in a way, in a concrete setting, to solve the problems by which mankind and civilization can go through. So as I said at the end of our discussion with the membership, I think Lyndon LaRouche would have been very proud. So that's what I have by way of initiation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. We're going to go to Anastasia. I just wanted to say before we do, we have several questions that have come in, and we're going to go to those questions as soon as Anastasia finishes. She is the executive editor of a magazine by the name of Leonora. She's just come back from a 3-month organizing trip to Europe and is bringing a changed perspective on how both her magazine and organizing can function in this time of crisis. Just want to say that in terms of this issue of the electoral process, we are looking at this from the standpoint of the people that created it. And the people that created it were the people that created the country. These people believed in what Lyndon LaRouche always called heavy ideas. We think that you have to take the idea of the future in particular and really get underneath that idea. How do you get the 18-year-olds, the 16-year-olds of this nation to become the engine for the transformation of the nation to what it was originally intended to be? And so when you're looking at those kinds of questions, there's a lot of different avenues. There's a lot of different matters that are to be taken up. So I wanted to make sure that Anastasia, who just returned about 48 hours ago, jumped in here. She's very familiar with what we've been doing. So go right ahead. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I definitely want to express some of my reflections on the trip, because I did have an opportunity to go and talk to the population in Germany. But you also get to talk with many different people from different countries, people who are coming into Germany, and especially around this war situation. I mean, I was on a few weeks back, and I gave a little bit of a sense of this. But one insight that I had is that all of us as organizers really have to view ourselves as world citizens and not simply as people of our own country. And once you do that, it'll actually free you from the feeling of being isolated and trapped. Because I was able to go out and talk to the population in Germany, not as a German, but as an American speaking to Germans. And that completely changed the relationship. And I can give a couple of examples of how this was actually really useful, because the opinion in Europe from a lot of Europeans that are not crazy, which hopefully we are able to rally many more of those kinds of people, but is that there's nothing there in the United States. There's no hope in the United States. There's nobody sane there. And we obviously have been able to disprove that through starting from the April 9th conference at the Schiller Institute, the whole LaRouche movement pulled together, and then the interview that was done with Colonel Richard Black that Mike Billington did. This has now gone completely viral. It's almost 700,000 views now. This led to 2 more conferences later, the one intervening on Sweden and Finland, on their pushing forward to go into NATO, and then also this conference that we had with the military and security experts, including Colonel Richard Black and Ray McGovern, that this process of creating a dynamic is proving that what you think you see out there, in the mainstream media or on social media, or even what people say to you, is not really real. Most of it is orchestrated, or people are just repeating things. But if we can get under the skin of people and activate their minds, activate the creative powers of their mind, then they're able to act for the betterment of humanity. I was able to use actually Diane's campaign, just bringing it up in some of my discussions, and people were just shocked by how many petitions she had to get. I'm sure they'd be equally as shocked to find out that she did it, that she was able to get these petitions, and how many man hours it took. I think that what we're pulling together right now and people can become subscribers of the magazine, the Schiller Institute's Leonora. What we're pulling together is this movement to create a real renaissance, to create a thoughtful population that's committed to the betterment of humanity, a real maturing of humanity. And I'll come back to the point that I had in the beginning, that if we view ourselves as actors on a stage in a tragedy, because when you watch a Shakespeare play or a Schiller play, or you're reading it, you get the sense that nobody on there really is trying to change the way anybody thinks. But we have the benefit of being able to see that and being able to change ourselves and to intervene on the thinking processes of other people. So this magazine that we pulled together, Leonora, which we are going to be wrapping up the next issue, thinking about what are the ideas that we need right now to intervene on this tense situation. Because it's not just simply we're going to talk about beautiful ideas or fight with people on facts, but it's really getting people to change the way that they're thinking. So I would encourage everybody to do that, but also to, you can become a member of the LaRouche organization, and that'll get you the Executive Intelligence Review magazine and the Daily Alert. If you do 25, that'll get you 1 month of both. If you do 50, that'll get you 2 months of both. But we really have to educate ourselves right now on not just fighting on the tit for tat or wanting to argue over every little issue or present our facts. It's not facts that are going to win the war. I can tell you that right now. It's actually having the passion and intention to change people, which is, this is what Jerry was describing. I've heard this with many of the petitioners who have said that they've been able to get between 100 and 200 people to sign a petition with purely through the power of the ideas they were expressing, not by them convincing them or using a bunch of words or something. And I know that this is like a very common question that comes up for many people in the audience, is how do you change people? How do you get people to respond? So this is where you start. This is where you start from. You start from the idea that you're going to change yourself so you can help others change themselves to come to this higher level of principle. So please join us for the next coming conference that the Schiller Institute is going to be putting on. The whole LaRouche movement internationally will be joining June 18th and 19th. In fact, I'll put the link for a number of things in there for the registration for that, also for becoming a member of TLO and becoming a Leonora subscriber. So check in the chat box in a minute, and I'll put that up there.
Okay, very good. We'll just put that at the bottom of the screen, and we've been running the questions bar. We can run that again for further questions. I've got a group of questions, and what I want to do is I'm going to give one of the questions to each of you, and then anyone else can answer that question. That way we can cover them and at the same time have time to have discussion. Okay, so here's a question which I think there's two questions from Polena, but here's one question, which is, and Jerry, I'm going to give this to you. How do we create trust between nations so that we can move on to the next step of good human relationships? Or do we have to go through this period of pain and suffering to wake up? And we'll start with you, and then anybody else who wants to answer can go after Jerry. So.
Yeah. Well, you have to look now beyond any media show that's being put on. I mean, I thought Suzanne did a very good job of going at what this is up to. The reality is that except for a few Western European lunatics and US lunatics, the majority of the world has recognized that if they stick with the current system, they will be destroyed. This is understood. This was discussed openly in the recent meeting at the well, it was a combination meeting where the head of the SCO, which has Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Chinese Wang Yi, said explicitly, we have to have a new system of economic and credit, and the dollar cannot be the central currency, because as was demonstrated both in Afghanistan, where after we destroyed the country, we took what little was left of their reserves, just took them. And in Russia, we seized 300 billion of their reserves, dollars, and everybody got the point. The Chinese has $1 trillion or over. That at any point that they want to play games with you, they just seize your currency. They couldn't care less what the law is. So there is a very clear understanding of the fact that we have to have a new way of doing what we would call economics. But that way is defined in principle by the 20, 30-year fight of Lyndon LaRouche internationally. So we're not coming into this without ideas. In fact, many of the architects in China, in Russia, in India, have been influenced either directly or indirectly by the physical economic principles and the creative principles behind them of Lyndon LaRouche. In other words, if you were to define the reality of the situation as opposed to what you get inundated with every day, the awful shadow of an unseen power has now come to the fore under conditions of collapse. That's the reality of the situation. And nations that have before been slightly tentative are now saying, forget it. We work together for a new economic system, a new financial system, a new credit system, based upon this awful power, this awful shadow of some unseen power, which is LaRouche. And you will never read that, but LaRouche was the dominant genius of the last 30, 40 years. And maybe the most dominant genius in history. And I tell you, I've studied it. So I'm not just saying that. Now, we have to ensure that within the United States, which is why we fought so hard, this was a life and death question. If Diane was not running, you would have no chance within the United States, no chance. And then you just hope to hell that, I don't know what you'd hope for. But we did do it. And I called it, and often in about 3 or 4 weeks on this program itself, I called it the Lexington and Concord, that this fight was the Lexington and Concord. And most people, as I said, don't understand Lexington and Concord. This was not a bunch of farmers shooting behind rocks at some stupid British force. This was a cadre force who never put down their arms from the French and Indian War, who understood at some point it would come to a fight with the British. They were highly trained and courageous beyond belief, and they stung the British hard. And we know with the ultimate, they discovered and increasingly discovered how to deal with this problem and master this problem. So we are in a world of incredible potential, but you cannot listen to what you are told. It's all designed to distract you, which is what real poetry, what real science, what real thought gets you to focus on the actual problems. Look, we had this wonderful program in China where they're discussing how to make a breakthrough on fusion energy. This is the Renaissance that Anastasia is talking about. We're on the cusp of that, but it's going to take a lot of guts. It's going to get rough. But as the enemy just found out, we know how to play rough too. With humor, with irony, with science, with truth. That's hard to beat, particularly when all the lies are coming in on their heads and it's destroying everyone. But we're gonna have to do it together. We could not, any one of us, do it on our own. Can't do it. And we're gonna have to do it internationally. Surround them, box them in, do what we have to do.
Okay, what I'm going to do is to go to another question, and I'm going to ask Suzanne, you to take this one. If you have any response to the first one, just incorporate it into what you're going to be talking about here. It's a question from Ernie. He's asking the following: please discuss the many years of illegal actions against free elections in America in relation to the precedent of actions against LaRouche and other candidates. He's speaking particularly about the period of the National Democratic Policy Committee of the 1980s. He also says Operation Frumention against African-American candidates and officials might also be relevant. So he's asking for a discussion, and then again, anybody may have some additions. So go ahead.
Well, yeah, we would not be in the situation we're in right now if this hadn't been an ongoing policy, which again, I referenced at the beginning, this question of the Voting Rights Act and the fact that for 100 years after the Reconstruction Amendments, it took 100 years to have African-American men, the women didn't get it at that point, actually have protection of the right to vote. You have an oligarchy, and their policy is to keep people in continuous crisis and backwardness, and they feel threatened by any kind of serious development, which of course is very much in contrast to the ideas of the American Revolution, where it is that development which is the strength of the nation. I was very involved in the election, I guess it was 92, I tend to lose track, in Virginia, where we actually won national delegates for LaRouche at that convention. And it was quite amazing. I mean, we succeeded in every step of what were called firehouse caucuses, where people actually have to physically show up in order to vote. And there's local and then county level and so forth. And when we got up to the higher level, what happened is it was Mother's Day. I remember it very well. And the chairman of the Democratic Party came in his shorts, and he had been at a family picnic. And he said to me directly, he said, if you get the vote today, I'm going to read a statement saying LaRouche is a racist, he's an anti-Semite, and he's not a Democrat. And we're going to disqualify your delegation. I said to him, Ken, do you think any of those things are true? He said, no, of course not. But we were told that if you have one delegate elected from Virginia the entire Virginia delegation will not be seated at the National Convention. So the caucus proceeded. We had the vote. I was up all night trying to read Robert's Rules of Order, which I knew nothing about, because that's how they proceeded with the meeting. And, he got up there and he read that, and the whole place exploded. And we had delegates who had never been involved in the political process. One woman, she went, had her hair done at the hairdresser. It was a big event. She brought her son. We had another guy who was a Vietnam vet. He had his baby. They were devastated. They were part of the political process. They went to the convention. They did what they were supposed to do. Now, you had to ask yourself, and this ties in, I think, to the first question. I do not believe that you have to wait until everything collapses and then say people are then going to change. I don't think that it works that way. I think that the reason they didn't want to accept our delegate at that Democratic convention, you have to realize it was one delegate. Gore had, I forget how many. I mean, he had, thousands of delegates. Our one LaRouche delegate was not going to beat Gore at the National Convention, but what it was going to do was to show a potentiality. It was going to be a breakthrough. It was going to demonstrate that a controlled environment, which is the way these people function, they create, and they've done many psychological warfare studies to figure out how to control masses of people. And one way they do it is to control the environment in which you function and give you two choices which you can battle out in that controlled environment. And most people spend most of their time battling between A and B. What we were doing was we were going to break the controlled environment, explode it, and show there are other options. And in fact, what we find is that one of the reasons they attacked us and attacked LaRouche was not strictly because they wanted to attack him. They wanted to attack the population and their sense of their own potential. If you break the environment, people find their own potential, their own creativity, their own ability to think in ways they hadn't thought were possible. And that is what they considered a threat. So that was an example of the kind of things that went on in an ongoing series of manipulations. Ernie mentioned, Frew mentioned, this was an attack on African-American elected officials who were attacked and set up in different kind of sting operations to destroy their potential. You go down the line on this. This is the way this thing functions. I referenced, for instance, but I didn't read it because I didn't want to take any more time on it. But this British report in 2018, where they did a report again on their version, it was a House of Lords report. Just think about the implication of an oligarchy and their relationship to an election, and the fact that people might get out of control. They say in this report, quote, the U.S. administration has taken a number of high-profile unilateral foreign policy decisions that are contrary to the interests of the United Kingdom. How damaging this will be to what has hitherto been the UK's most important international relationship will depend on whether the current approach is an enduring trend. Should President Trump win a second term or a similar administration succeed him, the damage to the UK-US relationship will be longer lasting. They then said they had to reach out to its American, to people they said were deeply entwined in the US defense and intelligence establishment, quote, who share our views and values. And then they discuss the need to take this down. They also, in this report, discuss the fact that the one road, one belt, that policy is also a security threat to the continued existence of the empire. This is the way they think, their power and their right to do this, because they fear the potential of people. And what people recognize is that they have that potential. And that's, I think, the kind of thing we saw with those people who were out there petitioning against what seemed to be all odds, but they recognized that the country had a potential and they wanted to bring it into fruition. And I think that's the way you change the relationship among nations. I don't think you're going to change it when, after the nuclear bombs have flown. I think it's a question of recognizing the positive potentials within ourselves, within our society, and within our relationship with other nations, that if people act on that, that we can create the kind of shift that's needed.
Okay. The next question, which we're going to go to Anastasia on, is the following. And this is also from Polena. It's 100,000 people die in the United States from drug overdoses in a year, last year particularly. Have people lost all meaning in their lives? And is this a form of spiritual starvation?
Well, I have a few thoughts on it. I think, yeah, it is a form of spiritual starvation. I'm not sure exactly how you mean it, but the way I'm seeing it is that you've had a degeneration, of really going back. Mr. LaRouche talked about after the death of John F. Kennedy, that there was just a shutting down of morality in the population, that people were scared to tell the truth. They were terrified. People who were decent all of a sudden started backtracking on, speaking out on what they know it was true. But then you also had a cultural attack that had been going on for a while, with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. If you don't know what that is, you should definitely look that up, and how they've been orchestrating music, education, repetitive lines, and if you ever wonder, well, why does all the music sound the same, and why are they always around 2 minutes or 3 minutes? Well, it was all made that way. But one thing that actually I've been talking about with a number of people in the organization who are working on recruiting a youth movement is that it's gotten to a point where the youth they're in such an existential state right now that they actually don't, you can't even fight with an ideology, because there's not a lot of ideology to fight with. They don't believe in anything. So people feel very empty. And I think that this is the real importance of us sparking the human creative powers in every human being. That if people can work on classical artistic composition, this is not just a time period, this is a way of thinking about composition. People work on, classical music, work on classical literature. They work on making scientific breakthroughs, at least understanding the ones that were already made, how they got to that point, what was the thinking involved to get there. Then you actually have something to work with. And I think everybody can recognize, just looking at these shootings that are going on, that have been going on, it's like every day. And there's plenty that you don't even hear about because they don't make frontline news. But this is happening all the time in the United States. This is not simply like a gun rights issue. Should you have guns? Should you not have guns? This is actually a breakdown of the health, the mental health of our youth. There's a lack of a future, and we can actually revive that. We can create that. So I'd say, get involved with what we're doing and creating this movement, and not just in the United States, but internationally. That it's not just a matter of saying what policies do we need, but creating the inspiration within everybody to see that they can make fundamental breakthroughs. That's what's going to, I think, make these people solid again, these kinds of folks that you're talking about.
Okay, so we're going to go to sort of summary remarks at this point. And again, if there's anything that was provoked by those questions, feel free to incorporate that or address it. So let me start with you first, Jerry. think you're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted here. Yeah, no, this has been a very enlightening discussion all the way around, and I think we're on the cusp of a total transformation. It's what Harley said actually in the beginning. What is a strategic conjunctural perspective? There are certain moments in history. Shelley, of course, discusses it in his Defense of Poetry, where he says people can understand impassioned and profound conceptions with respecting man and nature. There becomes an electrified atmosphere. Look at what Diane put out today. If you haven't gotten it, get your hands on it. It's beautiful, it's brilliant, but it comes from an understanding of where we are and the emergence of your immortal self, which defines what your mind is, what your soul is. And that's going to come out more and more, but only under fighting conditions, where there's a fight on. And that fight, led by Helga, led by 40, 50 years of Lynn, you look what Kennedy inspired in people, you look what Martin Luther King inspired in people, that a new leadership dominated by this culture and that commitment internationally, and you see it's going on internationally, I think we have a lot more potential, but we got to get together. I mean, there's no way. International, break the back of these guys. They thoroughly deserve it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jerry. Suzanne?
Yeah, well, I think we should break the back of these guys, because this question of the right of self-government is, and the concepts of the American Revolution. I mean, the U.S. has become so identified in a very tragic way with the Anglo-American system rather than the American Revolution system, that we've created a tremendous crisis for ourselves. But if you think about even what Jerry talked about at the beginning, I mean, this wasn't a natural occurrence. I mean, we've had nothing but assassinations of leaders in the United States, from Lincoln, Garfield, you go up to Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and others. But again, it's been an international phenomenon. Anastasia talks about the question of the international collaboration. I mean, the use of sanctions to remove governments, the use of right to protect wars to remove governments and countries' right to self-determination. It's not, it's quite relevant that there's been a lot of focus on computer voting. And one of the big companies, Smartmatic, the head of it was Lord Malloch Brown, very close to, in fact, he's a member of the Privy Council in London, but he was the one that developed with George Soros the whole concept of right to protect wars. These sanctions are designed to overthrow governments. So you have this phenomenon internationally of an attack on countries' their right for sovereignty, for their right to represent the interests of their own population. On the other hand, I think what we're seeing is a revolt against that. And we see it even with this move by different parts of the world, India, the African countries, and others who simply refuse to participate in this escalation of the attacks on Russia, and which they're being told they have no choice. They have to do it because it's the rules-based order. The oligarchy is insisting on it, but there's a revolt against that. And if we focus on creating a revolt, which is based not just on refusing to go along, but a positive collaboration among nations, then the actual idea of the American versus the British system becomes palpable. And all the great art, whether it's Schiller, Wilhelm Tell, Mozart, with his attacks on the oligarchy, all of whom were backing this idea of the American Revolution, this can become something that can really, I think, inspire people about what we should be doing and the beauty of it, and where we can go from here.
Okay, and Anastasia?
Yeah, I think I'd like to close with the challenge for everybody here to go out and organize with us. Whether that be, if you're in another country, you can organize with us. If there's an office there, or you can organize with us on social media. If you go onto Twitter, you can find me on there. You can find others on there. Or you can go out in the streets. You can go out in the streets with us. You go out with Diane if you want to. You can go out with us in Detroit. We're everywhere. We have leaflets. But I think the key thing is that if you don't go out there and try to fight with the minds of other people, you're never going to see the potential. It's just not going to come to you. But as soon as you start to go out there and actually try to fight with another mind, you start to come up with more polemics. You start to come up with different ways of getting under people's skin. And that's actually a form of love. That's actually a way of loving humanity, loving mankind, is that you are so determined to help that person make a breakthrough that that person will respond and change the way that they think. So have faith in your own powers. I know it's frustrating and it's very tense. It's the best way I could describe it right now. It's very tense. But we can collaborate together and better ourselves right now. So anyway, join what we're doing and definitely use those links that I put in the chat to get our material.
Okay, Anastasia Battle, Gerald Rose, Suzanne Clevey, I want to thank you for being with us today, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. I also want to thank Harley Schlanger and Claudio Celani for their contributions. We're going to close today by our own form of commemoration. This is the 100th anniversary, not only of Lyndon LaRouche's birth, but also the opening of the Lincoln Memorial, designed by sculptor Daniel Chester French, which opened in May of 1922. That memorial has been essential, not only in the magnification and preservation of Lincoln, but of the American Constitution. Lincoln's two great poems, the Gettysburg Address and the first inaugural address, are engraved on the face of that monument, and they represent a response to the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, which was also written by an individual, Gouverneur Morris of New York. The promotion of the general welfare is not a United States idea, it's a concept for the world as a whole. The Queen of England is the leader of an empire, including the empire of the mind, and her empire has no written constitution. All it has is something called the rule of law. Abraham Lincoln was a leader of the republic, including the republic of the mind, and his republic has the most important written constitution in human history. It was Lincoln's mastery of that constitution that made him one of the great poets of humanity. As you can see engraved in those two speeches, which are actually poems, the Gettysburg Address and the first inaugural. While Shelley said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, in the case of Lincoln, he changed legislation. He created the circumstance in which the United States became that republic which was intended and implicit in the founding documents, including the Federalist Papers. It was his mastery of Shakespeare and his idea of tragedy that allowed Lincoln to cause the United States to not be tragic and to defeat the attempt by Britain, France, and other empires to destroy it. That attempt, which was called the Civil War by the illiterate, the War of the Rebellion, and the war against British imperial aggression by those who really understand what it was about. Lyndon LaRouche embodied Lincoln's approach to addressing the citizen. What we're going to do is we're going to conclude today with a brief excerpt from something that he presented back in 2003. It was during his 2004 presidential campaign, and he was speaking at the end of June, beginning of July in New York City out in Queens to a Pakistani organization, I believe is the one we're going to show. And it was an organization that was devoted to education and the promotion of the future. So the notion of promoting the general welfare for ourselves and our posterity was particularly important to this group. And it will serve as our conclusive commemoration of what one should commemorate in a leader. And that is the power of reason and the power of agape.
If you look around the world today, you have two pictures. One, a fearful one, a spread of war, threat of war, terror. On the other hand, in Asia in particular, Eurasia in general, there's a new movement, new cooperation among the nations of Asia, steps toward cooperation. Pakistan, India, China, Southeast Asia, Iran, nations of Central Asia, Russia, moving toward Europe. The world is in a great crisis, great economic crisis. The financial system is in danger of collapse and will collapse, but we can fix that. Governments have the power to fix those kinds of problems, and life will go on. The problem is, above all, is the mind of the people of the world. And is the case of Pakistan, as you have emphasized with your program, the supportive education program. The problem is, look at the faces of the poor of the world. Not only Pakistan, but the poor of India, the poor of Southeast Asia. And you look in the eyes of poverty, or poverty in Africa. What do you see? You see a mind which is the human mind, which is capable of doing everything every other human mind can do in general. But you see that the lack of education, the lack of hope, the lack of connection is like a prison. It's not only a prison in denying them the knowledge they need to have the skills to produce, but it's a psychological prison, a spiritual prison. They don't know the world in which they live. The world in which they live in the large is a stranger. It's a frightening stranger. And so therefore, when it comes to the kind of project with which you are concerned here tonight, the project of education for the poor, especially of Pakistan, who otherwise would not have the education that you're working to provide for them, we think that the spiritual goal is almost as important, or maybe more important, than the economic goal. I know that in the period of World War II, when the United States had gone through a great period of pessimism in the 1920s and early 1930s, we began to come out of that pessimism during the period of the 1930s and the war. We were able to meet the challenge of war and the challenge of the hope of peace which Roosevelt represented, because there was optimism in the people. I saw things happen in wartime, under wartime conditions, which expressed optimism. People would do what they thought was impossible because they were optimistic. And the function, I think, of education, especially the education in poor countries, is to give the child the basis for belief in optimism, for the belief that we can do things, that the belief that by cooperating we can make things different, we can change things for the better. And that's what I look for. I'm privileged now because of my work internationally in dealing with countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Europe, elsewhere. I see that there's the possibility of optimism. But then I see, when I look at the poor countries, such as Pakistan and India, which have many poor, even though many are not poor, but many poor, I think what will happen to the effort to build peace in this part of the world if we leave the mass of the population, the majority of the population, ignorant and poor, with a sense of hopelessness that can become a disease that can destroy all our wonderful aspirations. So I must say briefly, that to be as brief as possible, I can say much more about many things, and maybe you would like to ask me about some of these things later tonight. that this is a very worthy cause. It's a small part of what is needed, but sometimes we set an example by a small effort and hope that others will be inspired by what is accomplished by the small effort, and hope that therefore that example will inspire others to do more.